We're proud to welcome you to the Exceptional Advisor podcast series, brought to you by the Investments and Wealth Institute. This series aims to help you to better serve your clients, differentiate yourself from the competition, and enhance your ability to communicate those differences. Hi, I'm your host, Bob Powell.
My guest today is Daniel Crosby, the Chief Behavioral Officer at Orion Advisor Solutions. So welcome to the podcast, Daniel.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. Before we get going, for the benefit of folks who may not be familiar with you and your role at Orion, do you mind giving us a brief explainer?
Yeah, happy to. I'm Daniel Crosby. I'm the Chief Behavioral Officer at Orion Advisor Solutions. So that means I'm in charge of training tools and technology with sort of a behavioral bent.
So you have an interesting background. I'd love to hear you tell us a little bit more about that, and also the intersection of financial services and psychology.
Sure. So I'm a clinical psychologist by education. My Ph.D. is in clinical psych, but I'm also the son of an advisor. And so about 3 years into my doctoral training, I was just burning out, candidly. I was just getting kind of burnt out with the work. I came to my dad, who's a great friend and a mentor, and I said, "Look, Dad, I love psychology. I love thinking deeply about the way why people do the things that they do, but I don't think I'm going to do it in a medical context. Do you have any ideas?" And he said, "Well, there's a ton of psychology in my work." And, to my 25-year-old mind, I was sort of incredulous. Like, I had always thought of my dad as an analytical person, as a numbers guy, as a sales guy, and said, what does psychology have to do with anything in your work? And so without him having the correct terminology, he wouldn't have known what behavioral economics was at the time, but he introduced me to behavioral economics. And so after I finished my doctoral program, I got my first job out of school was working with a big bank and helping them vet executive talent pre-hire. And then I really got immersed in just the ways in which psychology intersects with the ways in which emotion and psychology intersect with money. And it's been on since there. And it's been sort of my mission to bring the insights of behavioral finance down from the ivory tower and into the lives of people like my dad, who are, financial advisors in middle America and may not otherwise have heard about these things.
Yeah. So you and others are pursuing helping advisors learn more about behavioral finance, behavioral economics. The CFP board is now making it part of their curriculum. Here at the Institute, we have programs, behavioral finance programs. This podcast will air during BFI week. But at some point, I believe you've said words to this effect that maybe at some point we won't need separate courses around behavioral finance. Is that your vision, or am I misreading what you've said in the past? No,
you're right on. I have young children. Well, some of them not as young as I'd like. They're growing up before my eyes. But I hope when they go to college, there's no behavioral finance course, because the whole thought of behavioral finance being sort of made other or teased apart from the rest of finance. Human beings are the foundational elements of financial markets, right? I mean, none of these things exist in the natural physical world. These are all human creations, and they're dreamt up by humans. They're run into the ground by humans. They're operated by humans from front to back. And so it's only as we understand people, who are the fundamental foundational elements of this system, that we begin to understand the system itself. So it's my hope that over time, behavioral finance and behavioral economics will become so second nature and seen as so much a holistic part of this whole operation that the distinction ceases to exist.
Right. So in the world of financial advisors and their clients, a lot of discussion is around this notion of risk and reward. Talk a little bit about, your thoughts about how advisors need to deal with that with respect to their clients.
Yeah, so we've been doing some work at Orion recently because I had this sort of aha moment because I have, one foot in practitioner world and one foot in academia. And I found this divide between the way that academics and practitioners thought about risk tolerance. So if you ask the average academic, hey, tell me about risk tolerance, they would say, well, risk tolerance is stable over the lifetime. It's relatively static. You can measure it. You can build, financial models and asset allocation models around it. And you ask the average advisor and they're going to say, what are you talking about? Like, risk tolerance changes with the wind. It's as high or as low as last week's returns. And so what it is it's kind of like that old parable, where people are touching different parts of the elephant and they're describing the elephant differently. There's really three facets to risk-taking behavior. And we need to sort of understand them, tease them out, and measure them and talk about them as advisors so we know how to intervene. So we've got risk capacity, which is someone's ability to take risk based on, their age, their timeline, their amassed wealth, the size of their goals, and these sorts of constraints, right? An advisor can address these things by saying, hey, what if you retired a little early? What if you worked a little longer? What if you, had this goal instead of that goal? Those things are all workable from a conversational and a coaching and a planning perspective. Next, we have risk tolerance, which is indeed the long-term willingness to make risk-reward trade-offs. And it does tend to be relatively static over a lifetime. And so you say, well, wait a minute, what about March of 2020? If a client calls up and says, get me the heck out of the market, I'm dying here. If you ask that client, Mr. or Mrs. Client, is this a good idea? Like, should you be doing this? To a person, they would say, no, probably not, but do it anyway, right? Like, I know my head knows I shouldn't, but my heart is telling me I should, or my emotions are telling me I should. That emotion is the third piece. That's composure. That's someone's level of anxiety proneness, emotion proneness. How likely is that hot emotional state of risk composure likely to buck them off the horse of risk tolerance? So risk composure is a behavioral coaching intervention. Risk tolerance is an asset allocation intervention, right? So we have all these different pieces, but we have to measure them independently. We have to talk about them both independently and as a collective if we're truly going to understand the entire 3D look at a client's risk-taking behavior.
Right. So it strikes me that advisors know a lot about risk capacity and risk tolerance, maybe less so about risk composure and how they would go about measuring it.
Well, I think that they understand it experientially and anecdotally, but probably don't know how to measure it. But that's fine because we'll help them do it. I think they see these things exist, but they're not psychometricians. They don't know how to measure it. But there's actually a really robust science that's quite old around measuring this sort of trait in people. And once you see it, it can become this early warning system for who needs help when things get choppy.
Right. So sometimes, Daniel, I think the profession spends a inordinate amount of time focusing on one type of risk, but in the saving for retirement years, you might be exposed to many different types of risks: interest rate risk, reinvestment risk, inflation, et cetera, et cetera. And then in the retirement years, you might be facing an entirely different set of risks: longevity, healthcare shocks, et cetera, et cetera. Does those kind of risks factor into what you're describing here?
Yeah, well, the market realities intersect with those types of risk, right? So things like, I remember when my youngest child was born, the nurse says to us, 1 in 3 children this age will live to be 105 or whatever the number was. And so I think, longevity plays into this. All the things you talk about, sequence of returns risk, inflation risk, all these sorts of things play in, but those are a little harder to forecast, right? Nobody has, I haven't seen a good inflation prediction model yet. So I think we have to look at history as our guide. We have to understand that person's, sort of individual psychology and do the best we can. I think there's such thing as trying to get too cute with it too, trying to be, overly precise about things for which we can't expect any precision. So,
right.
Yeah.
So the other thing too is advisors may have a good sense of risk, no standard deviation, et cetera, but there's a great deal of literature that suggests that clients are just really not that well versed in terms of risk and probabilities and whatnot, and that they don't understand it ultimately.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt. I mean, there's no doubt, and part of what we need to do here, and part of the reason I feel so strongly about the way that we measure risk is behavior change takes three things. I sort of refer to it as my three E's. The first E is education. We need to educate our clients at a foundational level about the way that markets work. There have been a couple of studies out recently that show that the average investor is expecting the US market to return 17% a year for the next 10 years. And if that's your expectation, I mean, I hesitate to forecast, but like probably not, right? And I think, you're setting yourself up for disappointment. And happiness is just the delta between your expectations and reality. So I think what we need to do at that educational level is help our clients understand some of the fundamentals of how risk works. I think one thing that surprises most clients when I tell them this, the average intra-year drawdown for the S&P over the last 35 years has been 14% a year. And yet every time we have a 10% dip in the market, you have a markets in turmoil special like this has never happened before. Not like it's something that's as regular as your birthday. And so, I think once we help set expectations and educate clients, that's that foundational level. And our, risk tolerance measures can tell us which clients are going to need more or less education, candidly. The second piece is we need the right environment. I would say that the primary thing that my study of human behavior has taught me is that most people are about as good or as bad as their environment. And so for clients, that environment is the portfolio. The risk tolerance questionnaire is going to tell us the type of environment that they can handle. We don't need a spreadsheet optimal asset allocation. We need a behavioral optimal allocation. We don't need a mathematical optimal in a vacuum. We need the optimal allocation that they will be able to stick with, right? That is the true best portfolio, is not some arbitrary mathematical optimal. It's the behavioral, the anxiety adjusted returns are sort of what we're after. And then the third E is that encouragement. Even when we've educated them, even when we have them in a great portfolio, there's going to be moments of panic. There's going to be moments where they want to do the wrong thing at the wrong time. And that's where advisors add a ton of value, is in a moment of panic or fear or greed, being that last line of defense between them and a risky behavior. So I think it takes all three legs of that stool to really move the behavioral needle. And I think that you need a good assessment of where their three legs are to begin with if you're to intervene effectively. So you're right. Clients don't get this stuff, but they need to understand it across a number of contexts.
Yeah. So during the upcoming BFI week, you'll be talking, the title of the presentation is The Psychology of Concentrated Wealth. And you'll be talking about the opportunities and challenges that advisors face to add value for wealthy clients with concentrated wealth. What, from your perspective, do advisors need to know about concentrated wealth?
Well, if you look at the richest people in the world, they all have one thing in common, and it's a lack of diversification, right? The richest people in the world have in common, like they're, there's men, women, from every run of life, but the thing that they have in common is that they're not diversified. And so this flies in the face of some of the most basic education that we teach most investors, but they can look to the, from everyone to Bill Gates to Oprah to Mark Zuckerberg and say, look, they kind of win all in and it worked. Well, because that's so alluring, there's a host of biases that we are susceptible to as we think about the decision whether or not to sort of maintain that concentrated stock position. So my session and our conversation will all be about sort of running through these different inflection points, these different decision points, and then we'll talk about how psychology can sort of distort our view of what's likely and what's unlikely, and how we can help clients have a thoroughly vetted conversation about whether or not to diversify away from a highly concentrated position like that.
Right. And obviously, the more concentrated, the greater the risk associated with that portfolio in terms of losing a lot of one's wealth if things go south.
Yes, get rich quick and get poor quick are sides of the same coin. So that's why it's such an important conversation to be had in a way that fully accounts for human psychology.
Yeah. So in your book, The Behavioral Investor, you talk about some of the impediments to sound investment decision making. What do you think are the biggest impediments, and how should advisors deal with that with respect to their clients?
Yeah, one of the things that I did in the behavioral investor is I took this universe of bias. There's, something like 200 different biases. And I looked at them and I said, look, not all of these have sort of unique predictive power. Like some of these are a particular manifestation of a larger sort of meta bias, call it. And so I looked at what are the biases, like sort of the granddaddy of all biases. And I came up with 4, and it was ego, emotion, attention, and conservatism. So ego is overconfidence, and there's a kind of a couple of flavors of overconfidence, but basically it's thinking that we're luckier than the next person, that we're better than the next person, that we're more prescient about the future than the next person. That's sort of ego. Emotion is just sort of letting the heart rule the head. Attention is our confusing what's loud with what's likely. Watching the news is sort of an easy example of this. And then conservatism is just our preference for things that are safe or known. So this would be things like loss aversion. We know that people are 2.5 times as upset about a loss as they are happy about a comparably sized gain. We know that we're status quo prone, that we are sort of prone to home bias and other sorts of sins of familiarity and comfort, if you will. So those are sort of the big 4 that we're up against.
Right. Now, obviously, advisors are probably more familiar with the typical terms, right? Recency bias, overconfidence, hyperbolic discounting, whatever it might be. This is new language for them in a way.
Well, these would subsume a lot of those. So something like conservatism would be a meta bias that would, subsume things like home bias, status quo bias, risk aversion, ambiguity aversion, loss aversion. What I'm trying to do is sort of give, and I talk about all of those sort of sub biases in the book, but what I'm trying to do there is say, look, if you're an advisor, if you can get these 4 things right, you're on the road. Because one of the things that I found was that, when there's 200 sort of individual manifestations of a thing to get right, it can be kind of come overwhelming. But something like ego bias, overconfidence, diversification effectively knocks that out, right? I mean, diversification is sort of lived humility. It's the concrete manifestation of like, I don't know what's going to happen next, so I'm just going to own everything. Right? Automation, Automation helps us overcome things like emotion and attention, just sort of having a rules-based paradigm. So my goal was to sort of distill to their essence and simplify this universe of broader biases, because I think it gives a roadmap that's a little easier to manage.
Right. So I want to turn my attention to, you've given a few TED Talks, one of which was titled, "You're Not That Great." And what's interesting to me about that title and that TED Talk is it reminds me of two things. I think it was David McCullough, the author, who gave a commencement speech at a college where, in essence, he told the graduates that they're all not that unique.
Yeah.
And I think that probably was a wake-up call to many of them. And the other is, most recently on TikTok, I'm not sure if you're a fan or not, but on TikTok, there's a meme of sorts, a video going around called Dad's on Vacation. And to watch it is to realize how not unique you are as a dad on vacation, that you're doing the exact same thing that every other dad on vacation is doing. So anyway, you might enjoy watching it. Anyway, talk more about that TED Talk and the lessons to be drawn from that.
So first of all, I'd like to go on record as saying my TED Talk came out before David McCullough's commencement speech. He was copying me clearly. No, I didn't achieve quite the same level of fame as Mr. McCullough did with my speech, but his is fantastic. The TikTok thing, I will be checking out as soon as we hang up here. But I can't remember which insurance company or whoever says, don't be like your parents. And they have these commercials of, people trying not to be their parents. And I laugh knowingly every time I see those. So
yeah, I tell my kids all the time that I'm their future.
So going to You're Not That Great. You're Not That Great for me was I'm always looking for themes. We just talked about these sort of behavioral themes. I like to take large, complex, data lakes, if you will, and find sort of a unifying theme. And what I did with You're Not That Great was my grandfather died before I was born. He died on the day I was born, 2 years to the day before I was born, right? So I was born on the 2-year anniversary of his death. And we have the same name. We look just alike. We like all the same stuff. And so growing up sort of in the shadow of this, great man who died when he was, a year and a half older than I am now, it's kind of a weird thing. It's kind of a weird thing. You contemplate your mortality from a young age. And so I've always been looking for, lessons for a good life. And when I was looking into how do you live a life that's exceptional? How do you live a life that's extraordinary? One of the common themes I found was that some of the most extraordinary people had done these extraordinary things by owning their own mediocrity, owning their own fallibility, owning their own humanness, and putting in place structures to try and sort of overcome that humanness. Jim O'Shaughnessy, who wrote What Works on Wall Street, I'm going to butcher the quote, but he says early on in the book, the trick to becoming a great investor is understanding that you're not a great investor. The trick to becoming a great investor is understanding that your susceptibility to the flaws and biases and boneheaded mistakes that you read about is just as great as the next person's. So You're Not That Great is really all about that. The ways in which humility can sort of paradoxically put you on the path for greatness.
A good lesson for all of us, I think.
Yeah.
Right. The world is filled with people where they think they're better than the average driver. Right.
Right.
Can't be true.
Yeah. Well, and if you look at going back to the biases, overconfidence is sort of the bias that emboldens every other bias. If you think you're untouchable, if you think you're luckier than average, better than average, whatever, you never put in the work to get better. And so, if there's just one bias that we want to eradicate from our lives, I think it's certainly overconfidence.
Yeah. We can talk about lack of confidence maybe another time.
Yeah, it's what's fascinating is if you look at you be careful what you wish for. If you look at the research on overconfidence bias, almost everyone's overconfident. Men are more overconfident than women. There was a recent study that showed Americans are more overconfident than Britons, things like that. Not surprising. Neither of those results is particularly surprising to me, but it's almost like everyone's either overconfident or depressed. Like there's not many people who have like the appropriate level of like the appropriately calibrated confidence. Like the bulk of us are overconfident. There's a small minority of folks who are like wildly underconfident. Almost no one is kind of like on the mark. It's tough being human.
Yeah. I'm reminded, I can't recall who said it, that sometimes you have to sort of dismiss the lack of confidence, or that Ted Williams, right, didn't hit the ball 6 out of 10 times, right? Yeah. But he never went to the plate thinking that he was going to miss 6 out of 10. He always went thinking he's going to hit 5 out of 10, or that he was going to hit the ball all the time.
Well, it opens up a fascinating conversation because there's all these places where overconfidence is rewarded, right? In politicians, like overconfidence is massively rewarded in politicians. Nobody wants to hear the straight scoop. Like nobody wants reality. We love that. People who are overconfident doctors and lawyers are rated more highly because, right, they give people a sense of security. You think about business owners and restaurateurs and things like that. Like every single person who's ever started a small business, that's a wildly overconfident undertaking. Starting a restaurant, starting a small business, the failure rate is crazy. Like from a probabilistic perspective, all of these things make no sense. And yet we're glad people start restaurants. We're glad people start businesses. So there's a lot of ways in which overconfidence adds richness to our lives. Like it helps us get out of bed in the morning. It helps me talk to my wife in my college class, even though I have no business talking to a woman that beautiful, right? I mean, it does all these things good for us, but then in markets, we got to like cut it out. So there are places in your life where being overconfident, I think, has a real positive effect, but just don't bring it to capital markets.
Fair. So obviously COVID is still with us, and I'm curious for your thoughts about the intersection of COVID and behavioral finance, and what, if any, lessons there are to be taken from what we've gone through and what we're still in.
Yeah, the biggest lesson for me has, been around loneliness, believe it or not. Pre-COVID, this was a lonely world. Japan and Great Britain had both recently appointed ministers of loneliness because loneliness had become so epidemic there. In the US, one large survey found that half of Americans rated themselves as very lonely. Research out of my alma mater found that loneliness has profound health impacts, that it's equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day, that it's twice as damaging as obesity for your health. And so like we had this social isolation epidemic, believe it or not, before we all got shut in our houses for 18 months, depending on where you live. Georgia's been open for business for about 16 months of the 18 months. But, so COVID exacerbated this existing loneliness. And honestly, I think it's a big part of what gave rise to the meme stock thing that you saw. I think people banded together in groups, right? On Reddit and other places. And if you look at the memes and some of the things around that sort of highly speculative meme stock trading, they often refer to themselves as apes. Like, let's band together, like let's lock arms. Let's have this primal group need to stick it to Wall Street, right? Let's get rich. Let's do it as a group. And I think a lot of this was sort of loneliness was the gasoline that provided sort of the perfect environment for this meme stock revolution to be lit. So I think a lot of the strange behavior you're seeing in markets, I'm a big baseball card collector. Baseball cards have gone absolutely bonkers because everyone's lonely and nostalgic and thinking about better times and, thinking about being a kid. And so I think loneliness sort of weirdly accounts for a lot of the strange behavior that you're seeing in markets. And I think once we're sort of all back out in the world again, I think a lot of it will abate.
Yeah. What's your favorite card or most valuable card?
My favorite card is an Ozzie Smith rookie. I'm a big St. Louis Cardinals fan. It's not my most valuable card, but it's one that I could never afford as a kid. And adulthood for me is all about buying the sneakers and the baseball cards I couldn't afford when I was a kid. So I have a good collection of Jordan's, Air Maxes, and Ozzie Smith cards. So it's a good life.
That's great. Well, I used to collect typewriters, but unlike baseball cards, they take up far too much room and they're not nearly worth anything like a Tom Brady rookie card. So,
yep, the Hannes Wagner card just sold for $6.6 million. My goodness,
that's insane.
Yeah.
So let me just stay on COVID for a second. We last year we did something called the Exceptional Advisor series, where we talked to advisors and what they were doing during COVID with their clients. And I'm not sure they did it necessarily to address the isolation and loneliness that their clients were facing, but many of them were proactive in reaching out and checking in and making sure that they were doing okay. And maybe it solved two things. One is to find out if they were okay, but also to address the potential loneliness or isolation that their clients were facing. Did you happen to see that in your world, that advisors were more proactive in that regard?
I did. And I was really heartened to see that. I think sometimes advisors, kind of to your point, don't appreciate what a lifeline they are, what a form of social connection and social support they are, especially for older people. I saw really great behavior from advisors by and large. And what's interesting is if you look at the research around memory, extraordinary times give rise to extraordinarily sticky memory, right? We are wired so that if something unusual is happening, we really hang on to that because we want to be prepared for next time. So the advisors that reached out and were proactive during COVID, and as COVID persists, they will have clients for life, right? Like these clients will never forget what they did for them. And I think the clients that were the advisors who were not proactive and didn't reach out may be in trouble. Like I think their clients will remember that. They'll remember that when, sort of the risk hit the fan, they were nowhere to be seen. So it is a good thing to keep in mind. You should just be a good person and check on your clients. But from a utilitarian perspective, this is make or break time for advisors. These are times that clients will never forget. And I think it's a time to be going above and beyond.
Yeah. So speaking of going above and beyond, given where we are as a profession and where you think the end state is, what needs to happen?
Yeah, so I think the next big step for behavioral finance is for it to become baked in to the fiber of everything an advisor does. There is an enormous amount of interest in behavioral finance. The Institute, IWI understands that. Organizations like yours understand that. There's an enormous appetite for behavioral finance because it's cool, it's quirky, it's different, right? It's now about translating that appetite and that interest into practical solutions. So how do we bake behavioral finance into a risk tolerance questionnaire? How do we bake behavioral finance into onboarding? How do we bake it into the way that we prospect, the way that we coach, the way that we run a client meeting, our technology, right? So at the point of decision, there's no such thing as a non-behavioral decision. Even the order in which things are presented has a material impact on the way people make decisions. If you look at some of the research that was done on the obesity epidemic among young children, they found that even the order in which food was presented in a school lunch line had a material impact on the way that the kids loaded up their trays and thus the weight and health of the children. So everything from, the most impactful coaching session to the most minute way that a technology is put together and presented to a client has a behavioral implication. And I think when we as an industry start to really consider those things and be thoughtful about them, we'll be there. But we have the rocket fuel of people's interest. Now it's time to take it and get liftoff with respect to sort of practical application.
Yeah, I don't think, to my knowledge, that many advisors are looking through that lens when they make decisions about whatever, onboarding, asset allocation, drawdown plans, whatever it might be, right? It's almost, it will have to be a conscious decision to do this. It's not an unconscious decision at the moment.
Yeah, I think advisors, I'm generalizing here, but I think behavioral finance is the thing that I learn about to keep my clients from panicking, right? Like behavioral finance is this very sort of niche consideration that if my client is really emotional, I'm going to pull out that bag of tricks and keep them from making a bad decision. And that's, that's good. Like that's a big part of it. I don't think the average advisor understands how pervasive behavior is and how impactful even small tweaks in the wording of a survey or small tweaks in the way that service is delivered can have a really serious impact on client retention and client behavior. So it's my job to worry about those things and help advisors bake them in.
Well, we're glad you're here doing that work. Before we wrap up, is there anything that we haven't covered that you think would be important to mention, or anything that you've already mentioned that you might want to reemphasize?
No, I think the only thing I would mention is I think that we can do a better job as an industry of using behavioral finance as a mirror onto our own behavior, right? As self-reflecting on who we are. What are our biases? Like, what do we bring to the table? Where are our fallibilities? What are our misperceptions of others? And I think as advisors start to kind of do the work to understand themselves better, I think we've done a good job of looking through the lens of behavioral finance onto client behavior. And I think it's time we turn that sort of that introspective light back on ourselves, and we're more thoughtful and more compassionate and more aware of who we are and how we could do better as the people who are entrusted with taking care of this vital part of people's lives.
Daniel, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you. And I'm sure that our listeners will gain a lot by listening to this podcast as well. So thank you for being with us.
No, it's wonderful to have been with you. So thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Exceptional Advisor podcast brought to you by the Investments and Wealth Institute. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe through iTunes, Spotify, or our website at www.investmentsandwealth.org/podcast to get the latest episodes of our Exceptional Advisor podcast series. For additional resources, updates on events, and exclusive membership deals, visit www.investmentsandwealth.org.